Today we're discussing sadness, depression, and depressive realism. This is my favorite topic, and to be honest, today it's going to be a story about my journey, my departure from psychoanalysis and back to psychoanalysis again. So initially, I was critical about psychoanalysis for it being not scientific enough in its approach. And then I started to be interested in clinical psychology and psychiatry, but I started to be kind of disillusioned in them and came back to psychoanalysis. So you'll see all the stages of me going into science, what I thought is a science, and then kind of going back, but bringing with me all the experience. So depression, the way we use this word, is considered to be disorder, is considered to be negative, undesirable state of our psyche, which we might claim is the condition of human existence which is pathologized, right? And because we exist in therapeutic society, most of our conditions are medicalized, are perceived as a subject for medical treatment or medical improvement or medical normalization, either with the use of pharmaceutical measures or just this psychiatry and psychology claiming what those states supposed to be. So depression is defined by American Psychological Association as the most common mental disorder. This is quote actually. And website states that it's fortunately treatable and lists such thing as therapy and antidepressants as something that can help you with improving your condition. It's also currently within psychiatry and within psychology, it is debatable whether they should present depression as a mental disorder. And remember, maybe I showed you in the first lecture that during pandemic, they started to put on their website that anxiety, a certain level of anxiety is normal. And with depression is the same debate, and you will see why this is happening. But for now on, this is a quote from a couple of days ago from the website that is a common mental disorder still. But what is considered to be actual disorder is what is defined in recent DSM, that is DSM-5, as a disorder is major depression, which to qualify for this diagnosis, you're supposed to have minimum 2 weeks of certain symptoms. There is a list of those symptoms, and symptoms having problem with sleep, eating, low energy, concentration, or trouble with self-worth. So those have to last for 2 weeks, and there's supposed to be a certain amount of them to qualify for depressive, for major depression. And this is also debatable, and we'll see the debate around this DSM definition of major depression. The normal therapy, which would be prescribed for now for depression, is CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. We will try some of that during those who are taking these classes elective during this week and next week. We will see how it works. And cognitive behavioral therapy is considered the current golden standard of psychotherapy, so it's less questionable, the least questionable type of psychotherapy, which is perceived as the most scientifically proved to work. It was initially developed by Aaron Beck, who is considered to be father of cognitive behavioral therapy. And he introduced something, so he initially developed CBT as a treatment for anxiety and depression. This is actually the treatment initially against depression and anxiety. And he identified something that he called depressogenic thinking, which he suggests is cognitive pathology, cognitive deviation. This is something that's not supposed to exist, and something that cognitive behavioral psychotherapists are taught how to identify and how to change, how to cure. Depressogenic thinking as such, unuseful beliefs as, for example, I'm worthless and ugly, no one values me, I'm hopeless because things will never improve, and things can only get worse. So we already see that within CBT and in positive psychology, for example, which is the most popular type of psychology today, there is this stigmatization of negative sides of life, and it is directly presented as pathological. And here, because depressogenic thinking was perceived as cognitive deviations, cognitive pathology, it means that if you have those depressive thoughts, it is presumed that you're not assessing, that you're not analyzing reality properly, that you don't see reality. There's something wrong in your thinking, and it should be improved in a positive way, right? Positive psychology and CBT would claim now that it's not true. That is, they do recognize the need sometimes that depressogenic thinking is not a pathology, that sometimes it actually is reasonable. But it's the way initially it started with this. Initially, maybe now there is improvement kind of that they're going towards the recognition of negative thinking as also important part of human psyche. But still, the initial thought, both in positive psychology, it's called positive. How can you improve it to include something negative? Because the very name suggests that it is positive. So, so it is initially start as stigmatization of negative thought, as something that doesn't represent reality clearly, properly, as deviates reality. And what they would do, they would almost mechanically just trying to change the way you think, and this would influence your behavior and emotions. And I will do it with some of you this week, but then we'll critically analyze what just happened. So don't worry that much. And the other type of treatment, the most common today, most of you know, your personal experience even, is antidepressants. This is also something that is automatic thought. When you have depression, you're supposed to get some antidepressants. But it's also questionable. And James Davis, one of the critics of phenomena of antidepressant, this mechanical prescription of antidepressant and association of antidepressants with happy pills, and something that has to be necessary used and prescribed. So he criticizes it, and one of the main factors of criticism, not only his, but in general, of psychiatry, of pathologization of depression and sadness, would be the fact that it withdraws those negative states of our psyche from the content, and represent them as self-sufficient, as inner states of a human. And it tries to directly influence this state of our psyche by just changing it mechanically or pharmaceutically, using different kind of drugs, mostly antidepressants. Davis claims that because of those contextual factors were overlooked, and such experiences, normal experiences that constitute human being as sadness, anxiety, unhappiness, were listed as symptoms and underlying disorders. And this prevents us now, this discourse prevents us now from seeing them as normal conditions of life. You have to be actually also careful with this criticism, because it's similar story as with Reef, that it tries to bring us back somewhere, probably. It implies, or at least there is this mood, that before we were using antidepressants wildly, it was better, and we was just purely suffering the way we're supposed to suffer. But it's it's not so. Okay, we were suffering. Now it's a part of. We were always trying to modify our suffering and figure out the stories that would justify our suffering. Now we have just more mechanical way of treating the suffering. It's hard to say which one is better, which one is worse. So wait. About the fact that those negative effects were withdrawn from their context, and certain medicine was prescribed, that is antidepressants, were prescribed as a treatment of them. James Davis provides a great example of Rolling Stones song about a happy pill, the yellow happy pill, which is directly talks about antidepressants. And he uses it as an example of this withdrawal from the context, that it's prescribes not taking the context into account. And it is known, and it's still so, that 2 out of 3 prescriptions are prescriptions to women. And initially, antidepressants were even initiated mostly with treatment of women dissatisfaction or hysterical mood. And so this song actually shows, we'll analyze it in a minute, you just listen to it. So there are those words in there, and we can see that the way they're presented, it's not a happy pill, but this synonym word is a happy pill. So they don't give you maybe happiness, but they are presented as a shelter. They are presented as something to tranquilize mind. And the context here is actually a wife, a housewife, and a woman, and this group of people with which antidepressants were initially associated. And for Davis, in his criticism, is that withdrawing from the context of antidepressant in this case, and concentrating on just the state of a mind and pathologization of this negative state of mind, which is depression and anxiety, without considering the context, for this case would mean that women are just perceived as sick, and no one sees as hysterical, no one sees the context of it. And whole context is patriarchal society, where they have to take care of children, where they have to take care of husbands. And this is the actual reason of their anxiety and of their depression, right? And treating them directly and presuming that there's something wrong with them, and they have to calm down and prescribe them medicine for that, meaning just to not to pay attention for actual problem that causes this suffering. And within the social critique, we would claim that it stops individuals from the revolt, right? If you get adapted through medicalization to such unjust conditions, you are adapted, and there is no need for you to rebel or something. But it's even more than this in the song. It's even more tragical, because he mentions, for example, getting old, right? And changing unjust conditions to which we adequately react with negative states of mind, like anxiety and depression and sadness, won't reduce all of the suffering. There is some kind of suffering in human life that can't be that we can't get rid of. Children will always exist. Well, not necessary, but so there are just some aspects that are more tragical than patriarchal aspect, and that's something that we can change and just be happy. So it's a bit worse than that. And in this case, if we analyze it as something deeper than this, the question with antidepressants, actually, we can see it in a different light, because to some irreducible suffering, you can, still need to persist, and antidepressants are just a way to persist with considering this irremovable suffering, especially if you recognize it, that it exists, and then what? what do you do? At least, like you have kids, right? It's not only about patriarchal society. What do you do with kids that would be just to them and just for you? That's the question. And there you have antidepressant, and it helps you to get through until they will grow up something. So the other example is, for example, worker, employee who is overworked, and he is prescribed, he gets prescribed antidepressants, and it helps him or her to cope with unjust work conditions. Therefore, instead of looking for a better job or changing something within his present place where he works, he would just cope with this unfair conditions of his life. And this is the negative side of what antidepressants can do. But any job can be also the very fact that you need to work. It's kind of quite depressive too. And changing one job for a better job, it still might not solve the problem, not always. The other criticism of pathologization of sadness was presented in this great book that also caused a scandal, and that was considered in development of recent improvements of DSM, is the loss of sadness. How psychiatry transformed normal sorrow into depressive disorder. So from the very title of the book, you see that it talks about normal sorrow as normal human condition. And the problem that it identifies is that it was transformed through the discourse of psychiatry into the depressive disorder. And the reason for them, for this, they claim are that all professions strive to broaden the realm of phenomena subject to their control, and therefore, for pharmaceutical companies, it was advantageous to present any level of sadness as something that, as depression, and as something that requires treatment. It is especially so after pharmaceutical companies were started to talk directly to the customers using like DSM parameters and pre-screening for depression, for example, in large corporations, and presenting depression as even small signs of sadness, pathologizing it in the advertisement, and presented it as a subject to for treatment of antidepressants. So this was the switch that made psychiatric apparatus and apparatus of pharmaceutical apparatus more powerful, and therefore it's not only a problem of psychiatry, but as far as they see it, as a problem imposed by pharmaceutical companies. But they would claim here that now, because of this discourse, because of this advertisement, because of such presentation of depression as a disorder, we would even treat some low level of sadness as a pathology, as disorder. But for them, they still presume that there is depression, which is actual depression, which is actual disorder. And the way they distinguish sadness, which is pathologized under the diagnosis of depression, which is normal sadness, normal human condition, and actual depression as a disorder, as something that actually is supposed to be in DSM and supposed to be treated by psychiatrists, maybe by antidepressant, is that if the level of sadness, it's still sadness, but whether it's adequate or it's not adequate. And adequate or not adequate is still a matter of a context. So, for example, if someone you loved died, of course, it's adequate to react with the most intense sadness, and no matter how crazily you are depressed or sad, it's still adequate because it's not it doesn't demonstrate how deviated your mind is. It just might demonstrate how you loved and valued this person and how it's hard to live without this person. And but it's also tricky who will distinguish what is adequate level of sadness and what is not adequate level and sick level of sadness, because you can put, and there is already in DSM some examples of those, I think we were talking about it, example of those events in our life, like threat of the divorce. They don't include divorce, but there are some examples that they present that post-traumatic stress disorder is adequate, can be diagnosed. But it's also tricky because we are all different, and some people would react on maybe on loss of their pet in the same way as other people would react to loss of their spouse. And it's not that they are sick, it's just they're special in this way. And in this book, they're also mentioning the example of Alexandria Library. Library of Alexandria was burned down. So is it, for someone, it might cause a great depression, but it's still also normal reaction to such a great loss. So some people like and value books more than other people, and we can't say that this is a pathology. So it's also tricky how to do it. And it's also the problem how hard it is to handle, even if it's adequate reaction, even if the context is we are accounting for the context, but it's just sometimes it's so hard, even though it's normal and adequate, that it's hard to bear. It's another question. The example they use about the context and that how the fact that we don't pay attention, or psychiatry doesn't pay attention to the context, pathologizes our normal reaction, is attack of September 11th, after which in New York City, every fifth of citizens had enough symptoms to qualify for diagnosis of major depressive disorders. That is, these people were crying, they had nightmares. So according to them, it's not that the truth revealed that those people, every fifth New York citizens, were sick. It's just that it was adequate reaction to what actually happened. And this is more, so it's not about how sick they are, and they just suddenly, this event revealed their pathology, but it's the adequate human reaction to, it just shows how terrible this event was. And we would be precisely surprised if people wouldn't react this way, if they would just act normal without showing those symptoms. And the recent news is that depression, the level of depression rised 3 times. And in this paper, during the COVID-19 pandemic. And in this paper, they precisely compare the level of current depression with the level of depression after the September 11th event. So now it's even worse. And now it's the question, so most of us, a lot of us have depression, and now it's a question, can we actually consider it pathology if, especially considering that it includes psychotherapists in this group, because they witness most of human suffering, and they are those who we rely for help. The other scandal with antidepressants, the first major scandal with antidepressants was Irving Kirsch research, which he conducted in 90s. This is his later paper, but his claim is that antidepressants mostly work because of the placebo effect. It wasn't his goal to work with antidepressants. He was just conducting research on placebo effect, and accidentally according to him, he found out that antidepressants don't work as a placebo. This is the result of his research. So he was comparing the effect of placebo, where the group of patients during the experiment were given just a sugar pill, and it was claimed that those are antidepressants, actual drugs to heal depression. And in comparison to actual drug, the difference is not is really small. He also puts there psychotherapy, which has the best results. So the difference was only 1.8 according to Hamilton scale, and Hamilton scale is the scale that you use to measure the level of depression. I think maximum is 50 something, but norm is less than 7 points on Hamilton scale. So the improvement is not that big. I mean, in comparison to actual drugs and placebo, it's not big because you will get 6 points improvement only if you sleep better. And Kirsch claimed, and it's true, that according to general recommendation of medical society, the effect is considered clinically important, significant if it's more than 3 points, but it is preferable if it's at least 7 points. So 1 and 8 is not enough to consider it significant, clinically significant improvement. He also claimed that it's the whole thing is about placebo, but with drug they react better because they have side effects, and because they have side effects, they think it's better, it works better on them, like it worsens it. He still claims that even the new generation of antidepressant work like that. For example, the most recent research on meta-research on antidepressants was conducted by Andrea Cipriani, so the result, and this is Kirsch's reaction on this research. So Kirsch claims that they found that antidepressants work a little bit better than in Kirsch analysis, but Kirsch claimed that according to Hamilton scale, the difference between their difference and Kirsch difference is, so Kirsch difference is 1.8 and their difference 2, but Hamilton scale improvement. But it's still not enough, as we remember, because it's less than 3 and much less than 7. And this was conducted, 3 years ago. I think it's most recent one. So we are still kind of there. The problem with, we don't know how they work till today. And the other problem with antidepressants is that they have side effects, right? And the side effects are this numbness, the reduction in feeling, like paradoxically reduction in positive emotion, although it's first initially presented as happy pill. Both positive and negative emotion, reduction in passion, love, people start to care less, feel more emotionally detached, and they care less about things that they used to care. So Davis would call this effect numbness, and he would criticize antidepressant for giving this effect. And it's perfectly in accordance with Zapffe that the only way we can survive is just to numb our consciousness. It's not that, and this is what antidepressants do. So just numbing the whole thing. A recent generation of antidepressants has less side effects, but they still have those paradoxical side effects as tiredness, as a problem with sleep, and suicidal thoughts, which makes them completely paradoxical treatment, because those are also the signs of depression. They can't be drugs against depression can't have side effects which are symptoms of depression. And this is another problem. Well, the most recent trend, which I like the most, we'll get there. So the other problem with antidepressants that they are the way they function was proved by a chemical disbalance theory, as probably you know, because it functions as a level of common sense now, that there is lack of serotonin, which is a part of this chemical disbalance, that there is some disbalance in your brain. You need to fix it with using pills. The problem is that this chemical disbalance theory was never proved, and it will never be proved because it's extremely reductionist. And the guy who invented it, who came up with this idea, Kraut, he initially claimed that this is just a hypothesis, and it is still a hypothesis. So he presented the first version of catecholamine hypothesis, which later transformed to chemical disbalance hypothesis. And even more later, Alec Capen, who was trying to add to this theory and to develop it further, he claimed that at that stage, it was at 1967, he claimed, after developing it, after trying to prove it, he claimed that we are just in a slightly better position than Sanctorius of Padua, who just summarized a long time ago that might be also relevant at his time, where the bond of union is between the mind and the animal fluids. God Almighty alone knows. And it was long time ago, but actually we are still in the same, weirdly, with all the progress, we are still in the same more or less condition. And Pye's Psychiatrist, that was published 2 years ago in Psychiatric Times, he claims that now there are two myths to debunk. And one myth that psychiatry actually believes in chemical disbalance theory, and the second myth is chemical disbalance theory. So he was trying to disprove this myth that as it's presented by anti-psychiatry, that psychiatrists are evil and they just impose chemical imbalance myth to people. So according to him, serious psychiatry research base never believed in chemical imbalance theory and never will, probably. This is the problem. So if the work of antidepressants was based on chemical disbalance theory, we don't actually know how it worked. Well, it might be partially true, but it's very, very limited and simplified point of view. Now for the current trade. No, not yet. So the other problem is problem with DSM, which is presented, and I actually thought it were based on serious scientific research, but in his book, Daniel Carlat, psychiatrist, conducted not for his book. He conducted interview with Spitzer, and Spitzer was the team leader for developing DSM, and he actually asked him how they decided, for example, that there's supposed to be 5 criteria minimum as a threshold for depression, and he answered that it was a consensus. That it was a consensus of practicing psychiatrists. They just decided that maybe 6 is too much, 4 is not enough, then let it be 5. Based on their practice, right? Not based on any actual research. And it went to DSM. Also, same thing was 2 weeks. Why 2 weeks? Like, what happens with you on the 14th day that you start to be to have a mental disorder? It's also with the same principle works for it. The Davis problem, whom I mentioned before, is that psychiatry is not real science when it comes to non-organic disorders, which depression is, because we don't have biological markers still for depression, meaning we don't have kind of actual tests that show we have depression, like blood tests or some other kind of actual test. So it's not and same with the rest of non-organic disorder. It's just the consensus. Some people decided, also, okay, practicing psychiatrists decided that this is disorder, it's not normal. Patients supposed to show those symptoms, and then for 14 days, and then they would be qualified for major depression. And in homosexuality was erased from DSM only in 1973, because Davis' problem is that it's not, this is not actual research, this is not actual medicine and actual disorders with the body. It's, according to him, cultural work and cultural understanding and imposition of certain perspective, what is a perfect, not mentally sick human. For this reason, the homosexuality actually was included initially was perceived as a disorder, and psychiatrists, psychologists were trying to treat it. Well, in Russia, they still do for some reason. And this is great comparison from James Davis with a group of theologians who just came to consensus that God exists. Because they thought about it a lot, but it doesn't mean if they could just come to consensus is that God exists. It just proves that they believe in it. And according to the same principle, psychiatrists agreed that lots of human behavior and feelings should be considered a mental disorder, and they included it in DSM. So it's not as scientific as we want it to be. Yeah, and the recent article with those biomarkers of major depressive disorder, it lists everything that scientists had hope to see as markers, but at the end, like neurotransmitters and immunology, and at the end they claim that we are not there yet. We don't understand that well. We need to do more research on to come up with biomarkers. And the recent trend, most of you I think know, is psychedelic drugs, precisely psilocybin. And it was claimed it is not only those researchers who work with it, not only from Johns Hopkins University, but also many others. This is because quite a time ago, research which involved psychedelic drugs was forbidden, and now they change it, so we learn a lot. And it turned out that psychedelic drugs do work better to treat depression than antidepressants, even though lots of kind of research and tradition underlies antidepressants, and they are directly aimed to treat depression, right? It's not advertisement for psychedelic drugs. It's either not advertisement for antidepressants. You have to be very careful with it. It also means that drug dealers all the time are kind of more smart and more progressive than the whole, sorry to say, than the whole apparatus of researchers involved in psychiatry and psychology, unfortunately. It's the positive illusion. So we are slowly getting to depressive realism, which has the opposite perspective of than psychiatry. And for this, we need to consider first positive illusion. I was talking about them a little bit in the first lecture, telling you that our mind works, normal work of our mind or bearable work of our mind include positive illusions, like illusion of immortality, that we would never die. We just need to have illusion that this will never happen to function normally, not to get into despair. And other kinds of illusion. The most studied one is illusion of superiority. It's also called the Lake Wobegon effect. It is named after the fictional city called Lake Wobegon from popular radio series. And in this city, it was claimed all the women are strong, all men are good looking, and all children are above average. So all of them are the best, which is illusion because it's impossible, right? It's precisely because you compare someone with someone, you claim that someone is better, and all of them can't be better. But nonetheless, it's paradoxical, but this is how our mind works. And it turned out that this effect, that we all exist in the Lake Wobegon, that this effect is very widespread, the illusion of superiority. And it suggests that this is a cognitive bias of overestimating our own abilities in relation to abilities and qualities of others. So we assume, whatever we think of ourselves, we normally assume that we are better than average. And if you try to think, let's try it on you. If you try to think on any of your qualities, like quality of how friendly you are, quality how good your English is, or anything else, you would automatically, most of the chance, think that you are better than average. Although it's technically impossible that all people are better than average, because average is the majority, the average, right? So in almost all of the characteristics, research claimed that it's 75 to 80% of people would evaluate themselves as being an above average. And interestingly, people with depression, who are diagnosed with depression, are less biased when they think about their abilities. And maybe either it's the effect of them being depressed and not being able to implement, like this bias that helps them doesn't work anymore, or it's a reaction on depression that it gives them more realistic evaluation of themselves. For example, I'm the ugly one, I'm the ugliest one, this depressogenic thinker. Maybe it's actual, sometimes it's a reality, right? It's not always not true. Depressive realism as a concept appeared in psychology, but after it was introduced, we can also call using this term, we can call many people in the history of humanity, especially philosophers, depressive realism. But in psychology, it was initially introduced by Alloy and Amberson as a result of the experiment presented in paper Seder but Weiser. So during the experiment, what they did, they took the same amount of depressed students, not clinically depressed, it would be claimed later, but maybe just sad, and non-depressed happy students, and they gave them button each. And the button had different level, they had different level of control over the button. So sometimes button would just switch, would light up with a green light by itself. Sometimes they did have control of it, so the button would obey. You press the button and it gives you a green light. Sometimes it won't. And as a result, it turned out that those who are more sad but more wise, the depressed group of students, they actually had more realistic judgment, more accurate judgment whether they had control over the button or they didn't. So their thinking was more realistic. They understood, they didn't have illusion that they controlled the button when they didn't actually control the button. And from this, there is a whole bunch of research that would develop precisely from this idea that depressive thinking is actually more realistic thinking. It's not necessarily pathology that prevents you from assessing reality properly, from seeing reality as we maybe want to think, but on the contrary, it might give you more realistic view. And one of the researchers, Joseph Forgas, is famous for his research in depressive realism, which takes their ideas further. And some conclusions from various papers that he published is that sadness reinforces critical thinking, it reduces biases, improves attention, promotes skeptical and attentive thinking style, enhances empathy, and increases perseverance, probably because you are more realistic about what can you do and assessing reality more realistically. Unlike happiness, which we tend to like, but it has its dark sides. It makes, according to his research, people more prone to stereotypic thinking, so they are more readily go with the flow, they have more cliches in their thinking, they're more likely to make social misjudgments because of the biases, and at the same time they are more pleasant companions. But Forgas claimed that they are more pleasant companions, people we want to talk with, because it's easy with them to, like, to share rumors or to joke about the or to use cliches and they would approve it, or use stereotypical thinking like racism or something, and they will not analyze it critically. And so this idea that they are more pleasant companions doesn't necessarily mean that it's a good thing. It might be for not good reasons. So this is a depressive realism in psychology. And the other paper that I like, and the other research that I like, and is quite in line with depressive realism hypothesis, is Andrews and Thompson analytical rumination hypothesis. According to this hypothesis, they try to, so using this hypothesis, they try to present, to show that depressive rumination, when we have those hard negative thoughts over and over again, that it might be not necessarily a pathology, evolutionary pathology, as it's considered, that there's something, a sickness and something went wrong in our evolution, now we need to get rid of it and it's going to be better. According to them, it's not pathological formation, evolutionary formation, but adaptational evolutionary formation. So it helps people to adapt to and to solve the complicated problems. It helps them to actually develop thinking. And so we can even claim, extending this hypothesis, that thinking as such appeared because humans were able to concentrate on those hard thoughts that required them to do hard work of thinking, refraining from distractions, more pleasant distractions, and this is why they actually developed the ability to think, or this is something that led them ability to think and analyze, sustain analysis of complex problem, to sustain unpleasant process of thinking, because when you're solving unpleasant complex problem is unpleasant thing, you can't because it is complex problem. So the ability to have these thoughts that are hard to bear, and paradoxically, even though, like according to Freud, if you remember, there's something destructive in human that we, like in PTSD, we remember too vividly some traumatic event. So this paradoxical thing that doesn't give us pleasure might be actually something that creates us as human if we associate humanity with our ability to think. They compare depression with fever, claiming that fever, it looks horrible, we feel horrible, but it's not the pathology. It's actually adaptational phenomena, because it helps body, it's certain reaction that helps body to cope with infection. We can't claim that this is pathology that directly need to be healed, because it's precisely the state of body which might look terrible, but which helps body to deal with depression. And they claim that depression might work in a similar way. It distracts us, although it impairs other important phenomena, like personal, negatively affects personal relationship, work and social life. which is personal relationship. But nonetheless, this being concentrated on this negative thinking, it might be necessary for people to actually to process this, to sustain thinking process as such. And they claim that people, unlike the way it's presented in psychiatry as a deviation, as a pathological thinking or biased, negative bias, or cognitive pathology, according to people, if you ask them, they actually believe that their rumination, this when you repeat all over and over again and can't get rid of those negative thoughts, which constitutes depression sometimes, it gives them insight into their problems. So it actually has this result in the same. This is why they compare it with fever. Like fever is adaptation, even though it's not pleasant. Same depression might be adaptation to cope with, that helps to cope with a complex problem. But it's also questionable. The whole depressive realism is questionable because it gives you something positive as a result of something negative. It's still very positive thinking, like it improves your critical thinking, so what? Or it makes you smart, so what? And why, who said that it actually worsens our thinking and the ability to solve complex problems? So it's still a coping mechanism, positive bias, but for more pessimistic people who don't buy the direct positive bias of positive psychology. Those who don't buy this bias, I don't know what what's the next stage, I don't know. And in philosophy, just to show you that this thought existed a long time ago, that Aristotle can be already considered depressive realist, because according to him, those people as philosophers and as poets and artists are by nature melancholic. They have this black bile that makes them melancholic. And precisely because this happens, according to Aristotle, because of the nature of their character, because of what they do, and for him, of course, it was, they were better kind of people, so it's kind of positive bias as well. You feel bad, you produce something as a result of it, or it helps you to produce something like great books, and it kind of worsens. But what if it doesn't? Also, Schopenhauer, the one who Freud was mentioning, and I will show you his quote again. Schopenhauer, as a pessimistic, one of the most pessimistic philosophers, he actually distinguished philosophy from theological thinking, and psychiatry, as we saw, is to great extent is still theological thinking. So according to Schopenhauer, the difference between psychology and common thinking, which is religious thinking, is that religious thinking presumes that God created everything for the good, and God will win over devil at the end. So there is this positive bias that defines theology, that defines religious thinking. And he claimed that with this bias, as we call it now, you have to go to priests and just leave philosophers in peace, because they are different, they are depressive and more smart. And Freud, this is why I came back to psychoanalysis, he claimed that following Schopenhauer, quite pessimistic, thought that life is hell, not anywhere beyond, but actually this life, and there is a great amount of irreducible suffering that no one can do anything with it in human life. And he doesn't claim that, and he was okay with making money on promising people to improve their lives, but it's not kind of unethical for psychotherapists sometimes to promise their help, to promise their cure. And by the way, I forgot to mention that psychotherapy is not much better, right, than placebo effect. It's just more direct placebo effect for the most part, especially CBT. It is the way it directly imposes the positive bias. How is it different from antidepressant? The other thing is that antidepressants kind of have this evil dark side, but at least they're cheaper. right? At least, and they're more practical in this way. They also include human care, maybe to minimum amount, but when you go to a doctor who you consider a professional who wears white robe and who prescribes you as a professional not expensive antidepressants, at least less expensive than psychotherapy, and it takes less time. It's also a certain articulation of human care, but more reduced than because we are all overworked. It's like functions sometimes better. But let's see what will happen when psychedelic drugs kick in and how it will change our world. So Freud, with his psychoanalysis, follows pessimistic. He follows Schopenhauer. It's kind of more sincere because, as I showed you, he recognizes that psychoanalysis doesn't work, and he doesn't even claim that there is a treatment. He didn't want psychoanalysis to be the treatment. Hell knows what is it, but not the treatment. The way we now assume that everything supposed to be a treatment and a cure. Otherwise, it's useless. Actually, the end of this quote is, so the goal of psychoanalysis is that we have to make man conscious of this hell. And the end of this quote, I just reduced it the way I like it, that so that they can get rid of it, right, of the hell. But no, I just assume that the goal is just to make conscious of this hell, and for God knows which reason. And the last quote is from Zizek, who is a psychoanalytical theorist. He claimed that psychoanalysis is the only discourse in which you are allowed not to enjoy, so it's like a safe place from toxic positivity. But if you go to, say, psychoanalyst couple of times per week, it costs you a lot. But still, maybe you shouldn't go to CBT therapist at the first place. And one of the great books recently translated to English is Anthony Layden on psychoanalysis, disillusion, and death. And he actually directly claimed that psychoanalysis is above all the psychology of disillusion. So it's like contrary to positive psychology and contrary to CBT. It aims on the contrary thing, to install this negative thinking or to get rid of illusions. And I can't help, I know it's the third time I'm showing you, but I like Zappa the most because he explained all of it in just simple essay, right? In Last Messiah, claiming that whatever we do can be reduced to this four defense mechanisms. And it's not only antidepressants that we can see as something that numbs our consciousness, which is too painful, but also writing a book criticizing antidepressants can be reduced to this, to the defense mechanism from our painful consciousness. And depressive realism as such, which also has this positive bias, can be reduced to this defense mechanism. And there is no escape from this, right? Wherever we do, we can see it as this escape. For Zappa himself, our consciousness, he kind of values maybe sometimes our ability to think, our consciousness, even though it's painful, but at least we can produce philosophical texts like he does, and art, literature. But at the same time, he does claim that it's just the human consciousness is a biological paradox. It's a mistake. It's absurd. We shouldn't exist at all. And no matter what we do, it's just coping mechanism to live in this absurdity of our human condition of who we are. Although his problem, the other problem is that he claimed that animals are better, that they are not absurd. But in my view, it's like everything is absurd in its own unique way. I think that's all. Yes, thank you.